So welcome everyone to this roundtable, Perspectives on the American 2020 Presidential Election. My name is Frédéric Bastien. I'm Professor of Political Science at Université de Montréal, and I'm the Director of the CSDC, the Centre for the Study of Democratic Citizenship. For those who are less familiar with our centre, the CSDC is an interdisciplinary group of scholars based in many Quebec universities dedicated to the study of democratic citizenship. Of course, the elections, voting systems, party strategies, voters' behaviors are important themes in our research program. So we are proud to present with you this roundtable this afternoon. My colleague Declan Stolle, Professor of Political Science at McGill University and past director of the CSDC, has had the idea of this roundtable. She has recruited the participants and she will moderate this roundtable. So Declan, I acknowledge you for this initiative and I invite you to introduce us to the participants at this roundtable. Declan?
Thank you, Fred. Thank you, and welcome to this roundtable. The point of our panel here today is to present insightful research that can shed new light on the events next week that many say is of monumental importance, the US elections. The CSDC has assembled, as you can see, a top-notch group of experts, and I will briefly introduce them to you. And while introducing them, I have put together two important academic facts. That was actually very hard because they are such accomplished scholars to just choose two facts, but I think I managed. And there is also one fun fact for you. So let's start with our first panelist. That will be Jennifer Lawless, the Commonwealth Professor of Politics at the University of Virginia. Fact number one, Jennifer works on female candidates and generally gender and politics and has written multiple books and articles on the topic. One example is her award-winning Women on the Run, Gender, Media, and Political Campaigns in a Polarized Era. Fact number two, Jennifer is the lead editor, together with Kathleen Dolan, of one of our best journals in political science, the AJPS, American Journal of Political Science. Fun fact, Jennifer has actually been a candidate herself in 2006 for the US House of Representatives and therefore has great inside views on her research topic. And fact fun number 1.5, on her Facebook page, I have seen her with beautiful matched mask with her mom on nearly daily walks. And this is, of course, a COVID activity. Today, Jennifer will focus on how gender has shaped the races of next week. Did somebody say anything or to comment? No, I heard somebody. All right, the second panelist is Mark Hetherington, the Raymond Dawson Distinguished Bicentennial Professor of Political Science at the University of North Carolina. Fact number one, Mark is most known for his work on political psychology, polarization, and political trust. He has published numerous articles and books on the subject, amongst others, Why Trust Matters and Authoritarianism and Polarization in American Politics. Fact number two, more recently, Mark has further pursued to explain the big divides in America, famously with his Priors or Pickup, summarizing America's big cleavages in 4 simple questions. Fun fact, Mark has the cutest dog called Riley, who is being dressed up occasionally. And Mark, what is his latest costume for the upcoming Halloween celebrations?
I'm saving it for the slideshow.
Okay, good. The third panelist is Valeria Sinclair Chapman, who is an associate professor of political science at Purdue University. Fact number one, Valeria works on legislative politics, minority representation in Congress, and minority political participation, and wrote an award-winning book, Countervailing Forces in African American Political Activism. Fact number two, Valeria just recently joined the editorial team at our other top political science journal, the APSR, or the American Political Science Review, together with the other 11 rocking political scientists who vouched to make the journal more representative of various types of political science. Fun fact, Valeria vacations with alligators right by her side. Wow. Today, she will talk about the role of race and ethnicity in this election and changes in voting rights. The fourth panelist is David Barker. He is a professor of government and the director of the Center for Congressional and Presidential Studies at American University. Fact number one, David focuses on political polarization, culture wars, and ideational conflicts in politics. This started with his research on the role of talk radio and has now culminated in a new edited manuscript with Elizabeth Suhai on the politics of truth in America. Fact number two, David is working on a California State University initiative, the Louis Stokes Alliance for Minority Participation, which is a large program funded by the NSF to encourage historically disadvantaged and underrepresented minority groups in STEM learning. The fun fact, a few months ago, David became the father of a small baby boy named Teddy. And David will talk about a new cleavage that he sees leading to political realignment, intellectualism, or the so-called diploma divide. Finally, our fifth finalist is Deborah Thompson, an associate professor of the political science department at McGill University here in Montreal. Deborah just arrived here from the US a few months ago, just in time before the election. Fact number one, she works in comparative politics of race and Canadian politics and has done award-winning research in that area, which above all appeared in her book on the politics of the census in the US, Canada, and the UK. Fact number two, she works now on two projects, one on the American Black Lives Matter movement and one on racial inequality in Canada. The fun fact, there's video evidence that her 2-year-old son, Theo, sings Cohen's Hallelujah perfectly, which is very suitable for being in Canada. Today, Deborah will be putting for us the US election into a Canadian perspective and makes links to the recent BLM protests. So that's our introduction of our 5 panelists, and I soon will stop talking, don't worry. This is how we play here. We have short presentations up to 8 minutes of each panelist, and we'll have a response amongst panel members about these presentations. We will have a small round of questions for everybody, and then we'll go over to audience questions. And the audience can raise their hand on the Zoom tool, so you can raise your hand and we will see you, or by putting your question in the chat, and Ben Forrest, professor in geography at McGill, will actually help me to sort these questions from the chat and present them at the time when it's possible. So now let's go over to our first presentation. We will not use any mute buttons here, as we know from the last debate, but we will say when we are close to the 7-minute target, and then there's 1 minute left. And let's start with Jennifer, who actually volunteered also to not just raise the issues of gender here, but also to put the general picture of the elections into the perspective for us. Please, Jennifer.
Thank you very much. I am going to share my screen and let's see what happens here. Okay, so let me just quickly set the stage. We all know that the presidential election is what everybody is thinking about right now, but next Tuesday there are a lot of other races at stake as well. There are 35 Senate seats and 435 House seats up for grabs, and up for grabs might not be the best way to summarize it because party control is at stake in the Senate. Not every seat is competitive, but the Democrats only need 4 seats to take back party control. And the Democratic margin is in play for the House. There are 25 toss-up races out of 435, so it's unlikely that the Democrats will lose control, but they can up their margins. And then there are literally hundreds of thousands of local offices on the ballot across the country. And so I just want to give you a brief summary of where we are as of today. So these were just figures that I pulled down from 538 this morning. In terms of electoral votes, the projections have been pretty steady. And as of right now, it looks like Joe Biden has a pretty decent chance of winning the electoral vote. He also is very likely, based on these projections, to win the popular vote by a margin of 7 or 8 points. As far as the Senate is concerned, when I say that the Democrats have a good chance of taking back the Senate, that means that they've got about an 80% chance of winning the Senate, and the average number of seats that are projected will allow them to have a majority of about 52 seats. That's not enough to stop the Republicans from filibustering and making it very difficult for them to get anything done, but it is majority control, and it replaces Mitch McConnell with Chuck Schumer. And then finally, the House, as of today, we see that there's very little chance that the Republicans are going to win back the majority, despite what Donald Trump has said. In fact, there's about a 98% chance that the Democrats hold majority control, and a pretty substantial chance that they up their margin. Now, the interesting thing is everything that I just showed you has absolutely nothing to do with campaigns. And that's because Democrats and Republicans are incredibly loyal, and they are also pretty steadily, they're steady in the electorate, and they're roughly evenly distributed. And so if we look across the board from 1990 up until today, these are people who identify as Democrat or Republican, or as Democratic or Republican leaners. They tend to vote the way that partisans do. And so when we think about the way that party identifiers and leaners behave, there's just not that much room for much to happen in a campaign. And the best way to look at that is to just quickly look at this slide. The left-hand panel is the percentage of Democrats and Republicans who voted for the Democratic presidential candidate from 1980 to 2016. The right-hand side is the percentage voting for the Republican presidential candidate. And you can see across the board that 9 out of 10 Democrats in general support the Democrat, 9 out of 10 Republicans in general support the Republican. And perhaps the best place to leave us here is with 2016. Hillary Clinton and Donald Trump were the two least liked, most distrusted presidential candidates we've ever seen in American history. And yet 89% of Democrats still supported Clinton, and 88% of Republicans still supported Trump. It doesn't look much different today. Again, as of this morning, about 93% of Democrats say that they're planning on voting for Joe Biden or already have, and 91% of Republicans are going for Trump. Now, partisan loyalty is necessary. You obviously need that kind of loyalty in order to win an election, but it's not sufficient because there are a large chunk of independent voters. So a few things matter. Turnout matters. Are you able to actually get your base out? It's great if they support you. The next question is, how do you gin up enthusiasm so they cast their ballots for you? Second, what are you going to do with these independent and swing voters, especially in battleground states who don't rely single-handedly on party identification when casting a ballot? And that's why I'd argue that we need to consider gender dynamics, race and justice, the diploma divide, COVID, the economy, and the other issues that are part of the 2020 environment that we're going to hear about today. So let me just segue now into gender and the 2020 election to make a few points that I think are important as we think about what we're going to see on Tuesday. So we've seen at these rallies, Florida women for Biden and Harris. We've seen women for Trump. We know that female voters are really important. We had a diverse array of female candidates seeking the Democratic Party nomination, and we actually have on the ticket a vice presidential candidate who is a woman and a woman of color. And so when we think about that, it seems very inspiring, but let me now be the dark cloud in the room. Women's representation in the United States is horrific. So heading into this election cycle, 75% of the members of the United States Congress are men, 80% of state governors are men, 75% of state legislators are men, and 90 of the largest big cities across the country have male mayors. So we're talking about how this is going to be a year of the woman. Basically, we talk about how every year is going to be a year of the woman. There's a lot of improvement. So there are a lot of opportunities for women to really make a difference. And I just want to highlight 3 of them. The number of female congressional candidates we've got this time, the power of a vice presidential female candidate, and then finally the gender gap in the electorate. So let me start with the number of female candidates. 2018 set a record for the number of female congressional candidates. More than 500 women across the political spectrum filed to be candidates for House and Senate seats. And 2020 beat that record. In fact, in the Senate, 60 women filed and 27 made it to the general election. So we have female candidates competing in Senate general election races on Tuesday in 17 different states. But that's still just 31% of the overall nominees. And that's the same as 2018. In the House, 583 women filed. That's almost a 20 percentage point increase over what we saw last time, or a 20% increase over what we saw last time around. 300 of them made it to the general election, and they're competing in 253 out of 435 congressional districts. But still, that's just 35% of the nominees. That's up from 30% in 2018, but it's important to keep in mind that these raw numbers are interesting and important, but we can really only see the power that women have to shift women's representation in Congress if we consider the denominator. And here, we're talking only about a third of the races that we've got out there featuring female candidates. Women's candidate emergence is also lopsided. Taking us up through 2018, notice that As late as 2010, both parties were fielding a roughly equal number of female candidates for Congress. And then the Democrats sort of went crazy and began recruiting women. It was a nutsy idea. And the Republicans held kind of steady. And we're seeing the same thing in 2020, despite the fact that we have more Republican women running than we have in recent years. We're still talking about a very, very lopsided ratio. And that means that even if the Democrats make very substantial gains, there are just not that many opportunities overall to see big increases in the percentage of women serving, because our districts are so partisan that if Republican districts don't feature Republican female candidates, it's unlikely that you're going to wind up with a woman representing the district. Okay, turning next to the VP pick. Kamala Harris was an important pick. And if you'll notice, on the day in August when she was named, she had the most positive ratings of the candidates, largely because she was unknown. And that was a good idea on the part of Joe Biden. But the real importance of the VP pick here is that we had such a diverse array of candidates, male and female, from various races and ethnicities on the debate stage heading into the Democratic primary, that Joe Biden had no choice once he became the nominee but to signal that he was going to support the Democratic coalition by naming a woman to the ticket. And so that in and of itself makes 2020 a year of the woman. Not since 1984 have the Democrats had a female vice presidential candidate, and only once in 2008 did the Republicans with Sarah Palin. The early evidence suggests that Kamala Harris is doing an excellent job generating enthusiasm, especially among people of color, and that's going to be vital if Joe Biden is going to win this election. And then finally, the last point I want to make is the gender gap. In 2008, Barack Obama won women. In 2012, he did again. And in 2016, Hillary Clinton did as well. But if you read the way that the media talks about this, you might be misled in terms of what the gender gap actually is. The gender gap is the difference in support between women and men for the same candidate. So in 2008, the gender gap was 7 points. Women preferred Barack Obama by a margin of 7 points over men. In 2012, it was 11 points, 55% of women compared to 44% of men. In 2016, it was 13 points. What we're hearing this time around is that it's going to be crazy. Here are just some recent headlines. 2020 presidential election is on track for a record gap. A historic gender gap is possible. It's turning into a gender canyon. Donald Trump keeps begging women to like him. They keep saying no. But generally, it looks a lot like it has looked in previous election cycles, and it has held relatively steady also dating back to July. We see that about the numbers that we see today, we have about a 14 percentage point gender gap. And so it's not to say that 14 percentage points is not important, especially given that women are more likely than men to be registered to vote, and they're more likely than women to turn out and actually vote in elections. But the power that they have to sway this election, while significant, is not significantly greater than it's been in the past. And so I just wanted to provide all of that and put it into perspective as we turn to the other issues that are particularly important as we head into this election cycle. And I would just also like to commend myself for being only 9.5 minutes for both pieces of my introduction. That's all.
Thank you so much, Jennifer, for this introduction, as well as for the perspective on gender and politics. And I'm just handing this over now to Mark, who will talk about how COVID has played out in this election so far.
All right, so we've been doing a big data collection here at the University of North Carolina, a panel setup where we've been interviewing people over the course of the whole pandemic. I guess we started back in April. And I'm going to tell you a little bit about what some of those results look like and so forth. But before I do that, I'm going to talk about my dog. And you know, this was the Halloween costume that he wore last year, and I think it's a relatively difficult one to beat. He, of course, is a UPS employee, and the reason for that is the UPS man is the only person on the planet that Riley doesn't like. He's not really adept at scaring him off, but you know, all the same, it was adorable. All right, so one of the things that we often wonder about is, you know, who wins, the polarization or the pandemic? And I think there are actually a couple of interesting and different ways of looking at it. You know, one of them is, well, you know, polarization definitely wins. And I think nothing really, you know, makes this clear, I think, than the answers to this question. Do you think the number of deaths from COVID-19 is acceptable or not acceptable? I mean, you know, at this point, you know, it was merely 140,000, I believe. Now, of course, we're at 225,000. But, you know, 90% of Democrats said, no, that's a big number. That's pretty unacceptable. independents, 2/3, but less than half of Republicans thought that the number of deaths from COVID is unacceptable. It's a really staggering, type of thing, giving you a sense of just how strong partisanship is in this day and age. The funny thing is, though, about COVID and the election is, it didn't really have to be this way. What it reminds us of is just how important elite opinion leadership is when it comes to the way mass partisans react. So way back in April, which seems like 17 years ago at this point, we had our first COVID study out in the field. And we asked a set of different questions about which things people thought would be good mandates to have, or things along those lines to help mitigate the virus. And what we see here is really Republicans and Democrats in April pretty much agreeing. We see 10-point gaps or 12-point gaps here and there. But whether it's stay-at-home orders, closing businesses, mandating masks, masks weren't even a thing then. And yet Republicans and Democrats saw it pretty much the same way. And the reason, of course, they saw it the same way is a classic public opinion story. President Trump, didn't exactly, go crazy for these things, but he suggested that, probably these were important steps to take. And of course, Democrats who are at the elite level did the same. But of course, after April, things start to come apart. When by the time June comes around, Democrats are mostly at the elite level telling the same story. So, again, we still have 90, 80, 90% support for things like stay-at-home orders, closing businesses that are non-essential, mask mandates. But the Republican support for these things really starts to drop. And then, the next wave of our survey is in September, and they've dropped even further. So, you have a bare minimum suggesting stay-at-home orders are supportable, under 50%, closing non-essential businesses. Masks are a little bit more popular. But, what were 5 and 10 percentage point differences in April become 30 percentage point differences, 40 percentage point differences by September, all right? And this is elite opinion leadership. If anything, there would be some, sort of suggestion that Republicans might even be a little bit more sensitive to a virus, something we could talk about later on. And again, just sort of understanding the virus is pretty interesting as well. We ask people, how concerned are you about becoming seriously ill from COVID, broken down by party? And in wave 1, Democrats, and in wave 3, Democrats are about the same. But, again, the elite opinion leadership being provided by Republicans, minimizing the virus over and over again, really leads to this sort of drop in support or the drop in the belief of, maybe becoming seriously ill, from COVID. And, again, here we are, COVID is COVID. If you get it, whether you're a Republican or a Democrat, you have the same probability of becoming seriously ill. And yet, there you have it, very big differences by party. So anyway, how did we get here? We haven't always had partisanship where the pandemic would necessarily be beaten by the polarization. And, in my work, what I point up is, it's really important, to understand that what we're divided by now is quite a lot different from the things that we've traditionally been divided about in American politics. And this is happening in lots of other countries too, where we've moved from a sort of class-based, how big government ought to be divide, which we used to call the New Deal party divide back based on Roosevelt's presidency in the 1930s. And, it was a complicated, how big government ought to be, how much we ought to tax, things that people didn't really know or necessarily even care all that much about. But, since the 1960s and accelerating into the day, we're divided by these types of things: race, gender equality, law and order, where we come to actually hate the other party. What I've laid out here is how people feel about their own side versus how they feel about the other side using what we call feeling thermometers. And what, just to break things down quickly, because we're short on time, Democrats' feelings about the Democratic Party are in this solid line. They haven't changed very much over time. Republicans' feelings about the Republican Party haven't changed very much over time. But what's really the story is how Democrats have come to feel about Republicans in the broken blue line, and how Republicans have come to feel about Democrats in the other line. And these feeling thermometer scores are extraordinarily low. And a news flash for you, if I added Trump here, where do you think they'd be now? And we just have collected some data, and both Republicans and Democrats score the opposite party with an average score in the teens. That's like McGill weather. Anyway, so is there any way around any of this, or are we just stuck? And what we've noted as part of our survey work is how much people support these ideas like mask wearing and closing businesses and stuff like that. Seems to be an interaction between their partisanship and also how seriously they're taking the virus. So let's take a look at the people between April and June. The blue bars, of course, are Democrats. The red bars are, of course, Republicans. And what we see is that if you were either unconcerned about getting sick in the first place, or you remained unconcerned, there's a huge gap between Republicans and Democrats that happens in June. But what if you have a healthy amount of fear from the virus? In April, if you had a healthy amount of fear, there's almost no difference. And in June, there's still a muted difference between Republicans and Democrats. So if there's one thing that seems to have the capacity to punch through our partisanship, it's fear. It's fear of getting sick. If you think that your leader, if you're a Republican, is putting you in some jeopardy, you're going to be much less likely to follow your partisan predispositions. So, does this have potential implications for the election? Yeah, I think it maybe does. And maybe we can, sort of draw those out in the question and answer a little bit. Thanks so much.
Thank you, Mark. That was excellent. COVID as a potential unifier. And we are turning to our next presentation by Valeria. Valeria will talk to us about racial and ethnic divisions with regard to the election and voting rights. Valeria, please.
So thank you. I'm happy to talk a little bit about this. I already have questions for the other presenters, so it's already been an enlightening panel. All right. I want to talk just a little bit about America's changing electorate and what the implications are. I went to Pew Research Center this morning and pulled down some tables that we'll use to illustrate this. I want to say at the end that, or at the beginning and at the end, that there is in the US a changing electorate that is increasingly diverse. It's increasingly minority. It will long be majority white, but those shifts are important and they're taking place in major cities across the country. Blacks and Latinos are driving those kinds of changes. And the country, because it is so divided, as we'll see in the data, related to race and partisan politics, that there has been a concerted effort, at least over the last 2 decades, and certainly since the Obama election in 2008, to really reshape the electorate in meaningful ways that impact particularly Black Americans, but not only African Americans. And I'd like for us to think about that and what those implications are for state level politics, local politics, and for national politics. All right. So this table kind of gives us a snapshot of the changing American electorate since 2000. So over the last 2 decades, we see that the Latino share of the electorate has grown remarkably in terms of the population that is eligible to vote in the United States. We'll see that the Latino population, voting age population has increased, the voting eligible population of Latinos has increased, but that turnout, there's still a significant gap in turnout. So in terms of increases in the share of the electorate, we see that it's being driven by minority, racial and ethnic minorities. In terms of diversity and its impact on American politics and voting, we see that the Democratic Party has an advantage as the electorate becomes more diverse. A greater share of those voters prefer the Democratic Party. We see the stark differences in the Black population in terms of party ID, with registered voters who identify or lean toward the Democratic Party, upwards of 80% since the 1990s. A much more divided white population. The Hispanic population is, I think, remains competitive, even though it's increasingly Democratic, and likewise the Asian population. The Democratic Party depends on minority voters, and the Republican Party appears to have ceded minority voters to the Democratic Party. I would suggest that there is a lack of party competition for minority voters, although there could be. Certainly, Latino populations are competitive for the Republican Party. There is a Republican Hispanic caucus, unlike for Democrats. Only, I think, 2 Black Republicans serve in the legislature. And so certainly Latinos are competitive for the Republican Party. Blacks are as well. Blacks are conservative on many issues, highly religious, but the Republican Party does not appear to compete for their votes. Democrats depend on Black and Latino voters to show up at the polls and to help the party to win. Whites in the Republican Party, the Republican Party whites make up the majority share by large numbers in the Republican Party. In terms of what Black and Latinos are doing, there's just not a lot of room for the Republican Party to find growth in those groups. Another concern I think that we can see with, I did want to make note that there's little movement for Blacks and Latinos for these groups, but that the pace of change in battleground states is important. I think it's driving American politics and party politics across the states. In battleground states such as Florida, Arizona, and Pennsylvania, we see a declining share of whites in the electorate. And that is shifting, I think, the ways that the parties are responding locally, and it should explain the kind of voter suppression efforts that we see. If you can't beat the party, you know, at the polls, then you change the electorate and change access to the vote. And so what we see then is a growing share of battleground states with growing minority populations. In terms of Black engagement in politics, what we see is upwards of 80% Blacks supporting the Democratic Party, and very small numbers of Blacks supporting the Republican Party. So even if Trump is able to secure significant support from Black American men, which is questionable, despite kind of high-level, high-profile celebrities kind of engaging with Donald Trump, the turnout in elections, Blacks have been turning out for the Democratic Party at upwards of 60 and 70%. Again, you see the growth of Black populations in in battleground states. And this, I think, in the wake of changes in voting rights laws, has had an effect on the kinds of voter suppression tactics that we see in these states related to voter ID, to changing, reducing the number of polling places, to cutting the number of days that individuals can vote. but it also should have some effect, and I hope that we can talk about this in terms of, again, engagement in state level politics. You see that in Georgia, Blacks are making up almost a third of eligible voters. That has implications for state level politics. That is the reason why Stacey Abrams was competitive, the first time an African-American woman was competitive for a gubernatorial race in the state of Georgia. So the implications of changes in the demographics of states is important in American politics. Another area that we can look at outside of African Americans in the electorate is Latinos. And here in this table, we see a growing share of the electorate of voters as Latinos since the late 1980s, but also this very significant gap between eligible voters and those that actually turn out to vote. There is room for improvement, I think, clearly for the Democratic Party, and perhaps across both parties, and getting out the vote is going to be something that we need to pay attention to next week. And certainly in early voter turnout, which we haven't talked about, these numbers are quite remarkable.
So 1 minute.
Oh, thank you. Thank you, darling. My children love me. Another factor to pay attention to in Latino politics is that the Latino electorate is, a large share of the Latino electorate is young. And that has, again, some interesting implications going forward for Democratic and Republican politics. I will kind of skip just a bit to say that the implications of race and ethnicity for American politics are deeply related to changes in the Voting Rights Act from 2013 that really opened the floodgates. It struck down the pre-clearance requirements, basically saying that they were over 40 years old and they could not hold, that Congress needed to rewrite the pre-clearance requirements. It opened the floodgates to voter ID laws, purging voter rolls, reducing polling places, restrictions on registration drives, and the unequal risks that are faced under COVID. What we see though is that Black turnout is probably higher than ever. I saw some figures today that said that older Blacks are turning out at far greater rates than they ever have in the country. And so we see that in response to those kinds of shifts by states to restrict or change the electorate, that in fact voters are trying to be nimble and respond in terms of support for their party preference. Thank you.
Thank you, Valeria. Excellent for giving this overview. And we are turning to our next presentation, which is by David. David, about the diploma divide.
Thanks. And before I share my screen or start talking about that, I want to do two things. First of all, I want to apologize for the fact that my Newfoundland is at my feet and he's snoring. So you might hear some odd noises here. I'll prove that to you. There he is. There's. If Mark can show pictures of his dog, I can show my dog. The second thing I wanted to just add, for many of the people who are here listening to us, you might be thinking like, well, okay, you know, Jen set the table at the beginning and said that Biden had this really strong likelihood of winning. You know, I'd be thinking, well, that's based on polls, and how can we trust the polls? You know, the polls are wrong in 2016 and whatnot. And so first, aside from the fact that the national polls, you know, weren't, and also the fact that these polls show a much bigger gap than in 2016, another thing that I just want to point out for everybody, that if you don't want to pay any attention to polls at all, people have, and then this relates to what Valeria was just talking about, people have plugged in 2020 demographics, right, to the 2016 race. So we're not just talking about changes from 2016 to 2020 in terms of race, but also with respect to education, secularism, and education, right? And all of these things are important things that divide Democrats and Republicans. And if you just apply the 2020 demographics to 2016 and don't change anything else, you would have seen that Hillary Clinton would have won by 4 percentage points, not 2.2 or whatever it was, and she would have narrowly won Wisconsin, Michigan, and Pennsylvania. And so I view that really as a baseline. You have to say, like, okay, that's pretty much as bad as it can get. And then you say, well, do people like Joe Biden any more than they liked Hillary Clinton? Yeah. Are Democrats any more motivated than they were in 2016? Yep. And so that gets you back up to about 8 points, like Jen pointed out. Okay, so I'll go ahead and share my screen now. Okay, so the starting point here is essentially the same as what Jen was talking about earlier, which is the electoral college map. And this just shows that, right, if the election were held tomorrow, this is the strongest probability outcome, right, with Biden winning convincingly. However, you might ask yourself, well, how is it even this close, right? I mean, how is it that we're in the middle of a pandemic where 225,000 people have died, we're in a deep recession, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, all the things that we learn about and hear about in the news every day and have for 4 years? How can it be the case that 42, 43% or whatever some of Americans still plan on supporting and voting for President Trump given all these dynamics? And part of that answer is, of course, partisanship, which both Jennifer and Mark talked about. But another and related thing is this diploma divide, right? And so this is a new realignment in American politics that people, I think, are beginning to become aware of to some degree, but probably don't appreciate the extent of it yet. And so if you go back to the 1990s, Democrats and Republicans were about even in terms of the support that each party got from people with college degrees versus not college degrees. And if you go back further than that, to the 80s and 70s and before that, it was reversed, right? The Republicans were the party of the upper class, which meant they were the party of rich people, but that also means that they were the party of more highly educated people, right? That has completely turned on its head now. And it started in 2008, but it accelerated in 2016, and it has accelerated further in the 4 years since then, such that in 2018 in the midterms, if you have a college degree in the United States, you are about 25 percentage points more likely to vote for a Democrat for Congress. And if you had a postgraduate degree, you were about 35 percentage points more likely to vote for a Democrat. And it appears that this is going to be even bigger in 2020 to the order of 40, 42 percentage points or something like that. This is a significant realignment. In the 2000s, we used to say that the single thing that predicted whether somebody was a Democrat or a Republican more than anything else, at least aside from race, if you say were, for example, to focus among whites, was the extent to which somebody attended church regularly, right? So people who attended church on a weekly basis were much more likely to be Republicans than Democrats. And while that is still true, that gap is shrinking, right? And there are some signs even that some of these racial cleavages are shrinking perhaps ever so slightly, although those might be temporary, who knows, but they might be shrinking ever so slightly. The gender gap is holding steady, possibly increasing a little bit like Jen talked about, but this education gap is exploding. And it really explains the changing electoral college map that you may have heard about, such that states that, Democrats couldn't have dreamed of being competitive in, at any point in my lifetime, really, like Texas, are now toss-up states. Georgia, right? If the election were tomorrow, and it is just about tomorrow now, Texas is a total toss-up, right? And who would have thought that? And the reason is because Texas, has a lot of big cities in it with a lot of people who are highly educated. The same is true of, Atlanta and the suburbs around Atlanta in Georgia. This also is driving the shift in North Carolina. It already drove the shift in Virginia, turning that state from red to blue. It also works in reverse. It's the reason why the quote unquote blue wall, Wisconsin, Pennsylvania, and Michigan, were not as blue. They weren't a wall in 2016. And the reason why Minnesota has been trending in a red direction, as of course has Ohio. So this is a really, really significant development, but it's actually deeper than just education. it really reflects a more fundamental difference between Democrats and Republicans in terms of what we might call intellectualism and anti-intellectualism. So just to give you an example of a little bit what I'm talking about here. In 2019, according to Pew, 67% of Republicans now say that universities are quote unquote bad for America. 90% of them say that the national news media are bad for America and that you can't trust either of them. Both of these numbers are up dramatically from just a few years earlier. So my colleagues and I wanted to look at this a little bit more closely, looking at data from the Cooperative Congressional Election Studies in 2019 that we collected. We did a couple of things. First, we wanted to look at the divide just in terms of intellectual status, right? Do people who you could, label intellectuals in terms of their status or achievement, to what degree are they more likely to be Democrats now? And we define someone as a quote unquote intellectual if they either have some kind of a postgraduate degree or they attended a reasonably elite college or university, and we define that as anything in the top 100 in the US News and World Report rankings, either as a liberal arts college or a university, or 3, they work in a quote-unquote knowledge economy occupation. So they're a journalist, a teacher, an academic, a scientist, a doctor, etc.
1 minute, David.
Okay. The next thing is pro versus anti-intellectual sentiment, which is just a response to this question here. You can't trust media or scientists to tell us what is objectively true or false. You have to trust your eyes, heart, and gut. So that's the extent to which people agree or disagree with that statement. And what this all works out to is that if you are an intellectual in terms of status and you're pro-intellectual in terms of your attitude, there is literally 98% chance that you are a Democrat. Likewise, if you are a non-intellectual and you harbor negative attitudes towards intellectuals, there's a 79% chance that you are a Republican. So what this has led to is, and this is a reference to my book in 2019 with Morgan Marietta, we have one nation here, but we're living in two realities. And a couple of examples of that, the percentage of Democrats who think climate change is a real and urgent problem is 71%. It's 15% among Republicans. The percentage who think that that the rise in COVID cases is due to more testing, 19% of Democrats believe that, 72% of Republicans believe it. And finally, the percentage of Republicans who are sure or are very confident that Democratic leaders are not satanic pedophiles is only 17%. 50% of them say that, yep, that's true. And another 33% say, well, I don't know, maybe. So, the fabled marketplace of ideas in American politics or in any democracy, right, is really evolving in the US into a marketplace of realities. We are living in separate worlds, and that helps explain why half of us, roughly half of us, close to half of us, plan to do something that seems sort of illogical. Thanks.
Thank you, David, on this optimistic note and insight at the end there. Very interesting presentation as well. Let's move to our final presentation here by Deborah. Deborah will put it all together for you from the Canadian perspective and also adds some of her thoughts regarding her research. Deborah.
Thank you. And thank you all to all the presenters who came before me. You've made me feel slightly better about things that might happen next week. I don't know if that was your intention, but I do feel slightly better. So I just want to start off by saying that this is not what I do. I don't do political behavior, but I do think a lot about the relationship between race and racial inequality and democracy. And that's what I hope my contribution will be today. So for the past few weeks, I've been thinking a lot about the protests that emerged after George Floyd's murder and how some of the protest calls were, some of the chants were, this is what democracy looks like. People in the streets, this is what democracy looks like. And protests are certainly one democratic practice. And I think that it's one democratic practice that people have come to think of as being more effective, perhaps, than voting. There's a lot of disengagement with voting as being not conducive to creating the conditions that we need to achieve racial justice or the conditions for a substantive and meaningful change. So I think the big question coming out of the uprisings this summer was, would Democrats, which have positioned themselves as being the party that defends civil rights, would Democrats be able to galvanize the energy from the George Floyd uprisings into results at the polls? And too often, I think the response we've heard lately from Democrats and from people who consider themselves to be progressive is, just vote, just vote, just vote. Get out of the streets, stop protesting, just vote. And I want to pause on that because I think that while a lot of people who were protesting this summer viewed their mobilization as being galvanized by the Trump administration and a lot of the policies that directly attack communities of color and vulnerable populations, and certainly the massive policy failure that was the Trump administration's response to COVID-19, the Democratic Party is not the protagonist of that story, right? We saw politicians kneeling in the halls of power in Congress. Justin Trudeau knelt on the streets. And I think the question for a lot of us is like, who are you protesting? Yourself? Like, we don't need you to kneel, we need you to act in your capacity as democratic leaders. So I think that there's a not insignificant part of the population that doesn't think either party is likely to bring about conditions of racial justice, is likely to end police violence toward Black people, is likely to change the real racial inequalities, the deeply entrenched racial inequalities we see in American society. And the calls to just vote ring hollow, I think, in a lot of ways, given the immense obstacles that have been put in place for people who want to exercise this right. So let me pick up where Valeria left off. We've had several elections since the Supreme Court struck down key provisions of the Voting Rights Act in Shelby County versus Boulder, and many states have put in even more restrictive laws in place, including strict voter ID laws that make it harder to register to vote and to stay registered to vote, and laws that make it difficult to vote early or to vote through absentee ballots. We know that concerns over voting fraud, fallacious concerns over voting fraud have led to voter roll purges, not just in Ohio and Wisconsin, but across the United States, fairly routinely, in fact. As of right now, there are over 300 lawsuits in 44 states concerning how absentee votes are counted, who is allowed to vote early, and how mail-in ballots are collected. There is, of course, widespread gerrymandering in the United States. There are inaccessible and reduced polling stations, and there are reports of voter intimidation and the fires set to ballot boxes in California. In addition, most states have some form of criminal disenfranchisement. Florida, of course, has made news in part because the populace restored the vote for people who had been convicted of felonies, but then stipulated that the formerly incarcerated must have paid fines and fees in order to register to vote. And Michael Bloomberg stepped in and donated a bunch of money to make that possible. But we know that millions of Americans are excluded from the democratic process because of these laws. My Twitter, at least, is full of videos of people in crazy lines waiting to vote. And I want to emphasize that not everyone has 4 to 5 hours to sit and wait in line. This disproportionately disadvantages wage workers and others who can't take time off to work. Time, as Elizabeth Cohen reminds us, is a political good, and those with wealth and power can have more of it or can buy it. And this is not even to mention, I think, as David did, the 200,000 plus people who can't vote because they have been killed by COVID. or the obstacles that have been amplified by COVID. We talk a lot about deaths due to COVID, but there are a lot of people who are really, really sick, who can't get to the polls and who are unable to vote as long as they remain inaccessible. And in every one of these circumstances that I just mentioned, Black populations, Indigenous populations, which for some reason Americans do not talk about, and other communities of color are disproportionately affected. So I think it's really hard for a lot of us to accept the message of just vote when it's been made so difficult for Black and Indigenous and other people of color to do exactly that. And when American democracy is the means by which these obstacles have been put in place. I just want to make a second quick point. We haven't talked a lot about what might happen after the election. I teach my students that democracy is fundamentally about winning and losing. It's about, will the losers give up power when they lose? Will the winners bar losers from participating in politics after they win? And will we as the general electorate agree to abide by the outcome of the election, even if we don't like it? And we haven't talked nearly enough about some really scary scenarios about what happened if a former winner who is now a loser decides, in fact, to not give up that power. And I think that's a conversation worth having, particularly as others in the populace also may disagree on his need to give up power. And finally, I told Dietland I would talk about the view from Canada. I have very little to say about that other than that this all looks insane. This looks insane from the Canadian perspective. The hoops you have to jump through to register to vote in America seems insane to us. The lines seem insane. The fact that I spent so much time today looking up different laws in all 50 states because they are different in each state, it all seems absolutely mad. And yeah, that's all I have to say about how things look from Canada. But we are very interested and waiting with bated breath to see what American citizens do this time around.
Thank you all for these wonderful presentations and very thought-provoking contributions. I think we have a lot to build on. We do have some time left now. Obviously, we first maybe have a little bit of a round of a response while the audience gets to get ready to ask some questions by raising their hand or by putting their questions into the chat tool, which Benjamin will be watching out for. And I just want to start off this first round that we can ask questions to each other, the panelists, while the audience gets ready, with asking a few questions. Building on what Deborah and Valeria were saying, so I have some questions for all of you. Is the reason that minority voters don't feel that either party will be protecting them in terms of police violence and ending racial discrimination a factor here that will demobilize turnout and will kind of lead to a loss for some votes for Biden? So one question for Mark is whether the current breakouts in some of the states and in some of the battleground states, is particularly Wisconsin, but there are some other states as well, of COVID, will actually influence even Republican voters potentially to change their mind or to, I mean, it's really hard in America also to change your mind before the election, but will there be an effect of how deep the COVID crisis is? And finally, a question for Jennifer about the role of the suburban women. Are the suburban women the group that is, besides, of course, what David was talking about, the educational turnover, but is that the group that is really moving away from Trump towards Biden? Is that one of the group of women? So I want to just start it off with these questions. I'm sure other panelists have other questions. And of course, we also look forward to the questions from the audience that we will weave in when you're ready. So please, I start the second round. Thank you all. Anyone want to grab a question I put?
I can start, but Deborah, did you want to respond first?
You know what? I missed the question because my 5-year-old had her face smashed against the glass behind me. So
Oh,
please.
Okay. All right. Okay. I didn't write it down. I mostly just wrote some answers to it. So I'll see if I can get to it. I think it was, and Deelan, you can help me to reframe it. But it was really about the cost of, the potential cost to Biden related to the protests. That is the view that the Democratic Party is really not well equipped to be responsive to the kinds of concerns that Black people, poor people, minorities, young people have related to police violence and other kinds of oppression that minority communities face in the United States. And I wanted to tie that actually to a kind of response as well to you, Deborah. When you were talking, I was thinking about Bayard Rustin's kind of response coming out of the 1960s protests, which is the exhortation that Blacks move from protest to politics, right? And so that has long been a call, and protest is costly. Voting should be easy. It is probably the easiest way that Americans can engage in politics. It should be the least costly. And so the way that you shift whether people participate in this kind of engagement is by making it harder to vote, right? Which is part of what Deborah talked about. So I think that one of the things that we are seeing is cynicism, right? Of African Americans and others towards the Democratic Party. It is not unusual that people say it's a Tweedledee and Tweedledum between the two parties. They're the same. More than ever, I think 2016 and 2020 demonstrate that the two parties are in some ways so remarkably different. Historically, we would expect, we all know the Mansur-Olson, we know that our expectation is that the parties would actually come together, find their way to be more in the middle, to appeal to more voters. And Donald Trump has just tossed that out the window. And so this exhortation that you just vote in a situation where your life depends on it, but you don't trust the parties that are there, it's a tricky proposition. I think that we see it, I'm gonna move a little more quickly. I think that we see it though in criticisms of Kamala Harris and her record as a prosecutor in the state of California, and the criticism and the resistance that she's getting from particularly Black youth and others, young people, from Bernie supporters of the Biden campaign. I think that has been a difficult proposition for Biden, a difficult needle for him to thread. Biden as well. Trump has really pushed this idea. He did it in recent debates, pushing Biden on his support of the crime bill, and in the same way that he kind of got to Hillary Clinton with the language of super predators, really to discredit his opponent. It doesn't mean that you have to present anything better, but you can at least raise those kinds of concerns. And one last thing I think that Trump did effectively in 2016 was actually capitalize on distrust of Hillary Clinton in ways that actually made Blacks not likely to vote for the Republican Party, but less likely to vote at all. So Black turnout in 2016 actually dropped by 7 points from 2012. And certainly from the highlight of 2008 with Barack Obama. And that is incredibly costly in these narrow, in votes, elections with narrow margins.
Thank you, Valeria. If nobody else wants to take the question, or others who want to take the questions, Mark, yeah.
I'll real quickly, say that I do think that the late in the election season outbreak of COVID in swing states could make a real big difference, and I think that's true for a couple of reasons. One, Trump just does not want that to be the ground on which the election is contested. It's his weakest issue, and if you have 85,000, 90,000 cases nationwide with a disproportionate number in places like Wisconsin, it's going to be on the news. Second, we do even also have some evidence to suggest that people in swing states are indeed, at least in pre-election polls, punishing Trump if they got COVID specifically, not if they lost their job because of COVID, which is interesting. But if they got COVID itself, if they were physically affected by the disease, they're more likely to vote against him. And then the last thing that I'll add is a lot of those states that are swing states are states that are full of older Americans. So Florida, Pennsylvania, and across the Rust Belt. Older people are more vulnerable to the virus, and I think that it's a very tough sell for his sort of rock rib 65 plus group. At least they were rock rib in 2016. To make that case again, given just the illness out there that's deadly for them.
Yeah, I can chime in and build on what Mark said and also answer the question about suburban women. If you look at this election cycle, the biggest movement has actually been among seniors away from Trump toward Biden. It hasn't been suburban women away from Trump toward Biden. And so there are two things to keep in mind. First, right after Donald Trump was elected, suburban women moved. Right? They were like, oh, some of the independents who lived in battleground states in 2016 were like, oh, we don't really like Hillary Clinton. We'll give this guy a shot. It took them about 20 seconds to realize that they had made a mistake. And they've been polling sort of at anti-Trump levels from that point. This has always been an important demographic group. We had soccer moms, we had security moms, we had hockey moms, and now we're just calling them women whose husbands need to get back to work in Trump's language. But the reality is that they were already lost. And when the exit polls came out in 2016, we saw that among independents, men broke for Trump with about a 15-point margin over Clinton. Women independents, female independents, only favored Hillary Clinton by about 5 points. And so there was very early on a recognition that this was not sustainable, and the Democratic Party in general pulled them over. We saw that in the 2017 and the 2019 off-year elections. We saw it in the 2018 midterm elections, and we're seeing it now. So when we think about these shifts and these appeals, it would behoove Donald Trump at this point to try and pull back the seniors. He can't because he's literally killing them. But it's not the suburban women who have any propensity to go back in that direction right now.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. I think we are opening it up now also to the audience. And so if other panelists have a question for another panelist, I also encourage you to signal that to me by raising your hand in the Zoom tool. Then we combine the two. So I first give the question to David, and then we follow up with Isadora, who has had her hand up for a while.
Thanks a lot. I didn't mean to jump the queue. I did have a question, and I'm not sure if this is for Mark or if it's for Deborah or Valeria, or maybe all three of you. But I wonder what you guys think about the speculation that it's not a coincidence that the moment that Republican support for trying to contain the coronavirus dropped, happened to coincide pretty perfectly with the moment at which we realized that it disproportionately affects and kills people of color. And that's a provocative statement, I understand, but I just want to hear some y'all's reaction to that. Any of you?
Well, I'll speak to it real quickly, and then it looks like Valeria is ready too. I think this is not only something that might be happening now. I also have a sense that might be true about what led to the sort of sluggish response at the beginning of the pandemic. Who was being affected, at the beginning? Well, it was big cities, urban areas, and I think the perception, at least, is plausible. That the people in the White House were thinking, these aren't our folks. Good luck with that out there. And then, of course, it comes around, just like viruses do. But that's the best I have, David.
First of all, I think that's a great question. As soon as we started talking in the States more and more about the disproportionate effects on Blacks in particular, Latinos as well, in urban areas, you could see a shift, and it was tied to Mark's point, it was tied to cities. That is, it was the moment when, what's her name, Deborah Burks? I can't remember. We haven't seen her in so long. I can't remember her name anymore. But when she started to talk about, this is mostly an urban problem, it's a density problem, that is when the language started to change. And we also started to hear language not about how this is a national issue, but this is something that cities need to deal with. And so in terms of policy, it did begin to free people up. It signaled a change in strategy from the Trump White House. And it was absolutely terrifying to me. The use of race, these people are calling them dog whistles. These are, I don't know, do dogs scream? Like there's something other than a dog whistle to get some attention here. And I guess it would be the humans using it, but these are not subtle appeals. And also, and maybe Jennifer can kind of speak to this, the masculinity. There is a kind of way that Trump moves politics that is very masculine. The idea that masks are not, or somehow effeminate, that is somehow pushing, I would say, white men in particular, but not only to certain kinds of risky behavior. It's amplifying that kind of risky behavior practically as a matter of policy. And I see it right in my own backyard in Indiana, in the grocery store. And in the kinds of marches that we saw, you know, opening up government when people have to take weapons to somehow protest in Michigan and Indiana and North Carolina. So absolutely, I think there's that connection.
Thank you. Did somebody else want to answer that question? No? Then we go to Isadora.
For your interventions, I'm sorry, I was teaching until a little bit 3:15, so forgive me if this question has been addressed at the beginning, but I'm interested in how, as the clarity between political parties is sharpening around policy, how identity is also sharpening around political affiliation, whether there's reverse causality in that. I think in 2016, a not insignificant part of the Hispanic population who had identified as Hispanic in previous surveys started to identify as white, and this happened exclusively for Trump voters. And I see kind of an echo of this happening also with former Republicans who might, for some surveys or for some issues, still consider themselves Republicans, but because Republicanism is basically Trumpism now, would maybe affiliate as independent or be open to answering that they're Democrats, and what this impact, I'm a little bit worried about what this impact will have once, if Biden wins, if Republicans will leverage, or former Republicans will leverage this change in identity to shift the Democratic Party into a more centrist or Republican-friendly position, especially around issues of financing. So I think that kind of touches on expertise from everyone who spoke. So.
David has his hand up. Thank you, Isadora.
Yeah, I can start with that. So first of all, yeah, I mean, this is the reason why we hate each other so much, right? I mean, over the course of the past 50 years, every demographic, divide that you can name has become a political divide, right? Race has divided us for a long time, but it divides us more now. There used to be a big racial divide just between African Americans and whites, but now it's more so basically all non-whites, right, versus whites. The gender gap has gotten bigger, as Jen pointed out. The education gap has gotten bigger, as I pointed out. The religion gap, is much bigger than it used to be when we were kids. And so when identity overlays right on top of partisanship, And then you throw into that the fact that, as you pointed out, the policy distinctions between the parties have grown wider as well, then yeah, no wonder we want to kill each other, right? Because it's deep. It's these divides are fundamental to who we are now in a way that it wasn't before. I will say that that also contributes, I believe, a little bit to the relatively strong standing that Biden enjoys in this election, right? I mean, Joe Biden is a straight, white, Christian, male, elderly, working class background, and he's the first Democratic nominee in 30 years or something to not have an elite, an Ivy League degree. Basically, Joe Biden is one of about 20 people in the country who fit that description who's a Democrat, right? I mean, Biden has total Republican, Trumpy, frankly, demographics. And so that, makes it harder for him to characterize in certain ways and makes it easier for swing voters to accept him. The final point I'll make on this is just in relation to what I said, and you talk about what this might mean for policy. I don't know about right now and next year and whatever, but over time, if this diploma divide stays where it is, and this, frankly, class divide stays where it is, I don't know how much longer the Democrats, frankly, will continue to be the party of the working class as they have traditionally been. I don't know how long you can have a constituency that totally mismatches your policies, and I wouldn't be surprised at all if in 20 years things completely flip-flop, such that Democrats want to lower your taxes and Republicans want to increase welfare benefits, but only to certain types of people.
Provocative thoughts. Do others want to respond to that?
I mean, I guess I see the world a little bit differently. First, I think that what's really notable is the high-profile Republicans that are saying they're supporting Joe Biden this time are being very, very clear about how they're not giving up their party affiliation, and they're not eschewing the Republican Party label. They're basically saying, we don't support Donald Trump. And there doesn't seem to be much evidence across the board that there's this widespread party switching or anything that's long-lasting in terms of the party label. The other 2 points that I would make really quickly are, first, I think David's right about Joe Biden having some demographic characteristics that would appeal to Republicans. But when you look at his policies, he's a progressive Democrat. And so, I do think that there's this, on paper, once you look beyond the cover page, it's pretty clear if you're a Republican who your candidate is and if you're a Democrat who your candidate is. And then the third thing that I would note, and I think that this is significant moving forward, is that both the Democratic and the Republican parties after this election are going to have to step back and try to figure out who they are. And we know that after every election cycle, these parties have a reckoning, and they call in these pollsters and they call in these pundits. Kellyanne Conway taught Republicans in 2014 not to use the phrase legitimate rape, right? Like, they get together in a room and they're told what works and what doesn't work. And I think that after 2020, the potential for different coalitions to be forming and different issue packages to be coming together is something that both parties are going to address. I just don't have much confidence that either party is going to take it that seriously if they perform the way that they think they're going to perform. So if the Democrats win with the coalition that they had this time around, there's not that much of an incentive for them to rethink anything. And if the Republicans lose, what they're going to try to do is figure out how to rebuild the coalition that they last won with. They're not going to necessarily think about how are we going to peel off these working class Democrats, the 8% of whom might have gone from Obama to Trump. So I just think that progress will be a lot slower, even if there are lessons to be learned from 2020.
I'd like to add to that. So Jennifer reminded me that one of the things that I wanted to mention earlier was the autopsy. I don't know if anybody remembers it, but after the 2012 election, the Republican Party actually did have a reckoning. And it was when Michael Steele, it was their first Black chair of the Republican National Committee, and they rejected it, right? They went down that road, they talked about it publicly and rejected it out of hand. And if they had not, and somebody hopefully will write about this, what if they had actually pursued the policy recommendations and the outreach recommendations from the autopsy, we'd be you would hopefully have avoided the kind of candidate and presidency that we see with Donald Trump, who is really a Dixiecrat who ran in the Republican Party. He is a New York Dixiecrat, which whoever knew that they existed, but that is who Donald Trump actually is, and he's an opportunist, right? And he's nimble in that way in politics. Not denigrating him, I'm just saying that that's his politics, is that he is a New York Dixiecrat. The Biden Republicans, will there be such a thing? There may be. They will likely be temporary. This is a means to an end, because Donald Trump has offended basic Republican sensibilities in multiple ways. He's just exploded the deficit. His trade policies have been out of line. His foreign policy, in every way, for conservative sensibilities, Donald Trump has not addressed it. I think that was part of why initially many people thought, shrug, so what if Donald Trump got elected? He's a New Yorker, he'll be fine. And he was just really pulled, I think, strategically pretty far to the right. I wanted to mention a couple of other things just really quickly, if I may. One, I wanted to go back to something that, I'm gonna go backwards. One is QAnon. Like, I really would like for David to maybe talk about that. I am, and Mark, I think both of you, or maybe all of us, there is something strange going on when so many people in one party actually believe that the other party is demonic, right? So we've been having these kinds of conversations for a long time. We really need to, I think, engage these kind of religious framings. I'm not even sure how to make sense of that. I've been telling my class all along that if someone tells you that the other candidate hates puppies, you probably need to find some corroborating evidence, right? So hating puppies is not sufficient, and being a satanic pedophile probably should not persuade you. I'm also wondering, is the Republican Party destined to be the party of old white men, maybe angry old white men? I'd like for us to engage that. And is that sustainable? It is, if we organize government in such a way that, like apartheid, right? If we have a small white minority government, then it is doable. Demographic shifts and growth will not destine us to more inclusion in this country. We can certainly demonstrate that we can manage without it. And finally, I just wanted to make this point related to the COVID-19 conversation we had a few minutes ago, that I think in America, we do not understand the difference between disproportionality and just raw numbers. So more whites are still dying of COVID in the United States. Americans just don't understand what it means to be disproportionately affected. And so then it puts us all at risk. So.
I'd like to go back to the beginning of that answer, where David started, because I think it's a really interesting moment. And I'll try to bring in a couple of the other things. Someone brought up the autopsy. Well, I think the reason nobody ever took the autopsy as seriously as they might was because the Republicans didn't get killed. I don't think usually, parties take on a real reckoning with the, outcome unless, they get smoked. And they probably have to get smoked more than once. I mean, it's not anything, that I think we're going to see an immediate, sort of reaction to. And so it may be not surprising after 2012 that, the group got together and nodded a lot and said, okay. But one thing I want to go back to a little bit is, these, sort of identities laid on top of identities. And, it is true that that is the case now, but it's always been true, right? It's just a question of which identities we're talking about, So if we go back to the 50s, it was being labor, and it was being ethnic, and it was being urban, or something along those lines. It was class-based. And, what I think David is getting to is something really interesting, that if, the upper class people are no longer in the working class ideology party, then, that leads to something that, the Democrats at some point, are going to have to reckon with. And I think, they're not going to reckon with it having won, but they're going to leak supporters, at some point, when, the party doesn't deliver for those types of people. That is the people at the bottom of the socioeconomic ladder who don't, take, about taxes. And I think we'll see, upper income Democrats who have elite educations, wanting, lower taxes and, things along those lines. But I want to talk about the Republicans for a minute too, because I think Donald Trump added something new to the Republican Party that wasn't there before, and it's not conservative by any normal definition of conservative. And it's sort of this like hyper-competitive, aggressive, zero-sum, sort of thinking about the world. It's competitive as opposed to cooperative. And, we've actually tried to estimate, some use questions to measure people's propensity towards that type of a thinking. And it's not correlated at all with being conservative. But it is now, at least, correlated with being Republican. Not conservative, but Republican. And, so that ethos, that sort of thing is going to be in the Republican Party for a while. It's not going to go away. Trump won, by broadening out the coalition to include, these folks. And, Tom Cotton or Donald Trump Jr. or whatever, they're going to be, the same type of people dividing the Republican Party for a while, and I think causing, really serious problems within that coalition as well. So last thing I'll say is, because I think the Democrats are likely to win big in this election, it will require some sort of, I think, racial reckoning on the part of Republicans, for real this time. But they're going to have a really hard time doing that because of these sort of hyper-aggressive zero-sum people who have terrible racial attitudes. So anyway, I see, Larry, I have a response.
Oh, so, okay, I thought you had, yeah.
Valeria, I did actually. I couldn't unmute. My cursor was missing. No, but what Mark made me think of, this is really quick, is that hyper competitive aggression, again, masculine kind of stance from particularly Trump and I think from the Republican Party also manifests in these organizations like the Proud Boys and the echoes from Virginia, from Charlottesville, "You will not replace us," as if there is not room in this country where we've had generations, at least since the 50s and 60s, of kind of language around melting pots and diversity, to a competition amongst the races, a competition between men and women, a competition between rich and poor, where there is really not very much room at all, it seems, for cooperation. And that is, I think, going to be a challenge going forward for the Republican Party. And I do think there are some implications if there is a blue wave that runs across the national level of government, but at the state level, the politics are probably going to remain static. I would love to hear if we think there are going to be some shifts at the state level. That would be remarkable.
Let me just take this opportunity, thank you, Valeria, to say that we are actually at the official end of this, but we also have still a lot of questions waiting. So I wanted to ask the panelists, first of all, if it's okay if we go a little bit over time, or if you cannot do it, then let me know, or if we can at least try to answer the remaining questions that we have. Would that be okay with you? Not going too long, of course, but let's say we add another 12 minutes.
I can't do that.
Okay.
I can stay.
I can do 10 or 15 minutes. Sure.
Yeah, I can stay. So.
Okay, good. Okay, so we have, because there is lots of questions raised by Valeria that I think some of you wanted to respond to, but I also want to turn to some of the questions that have been raised in the chat, and there's also one hand up and some I have received privately. So I'm going to go to Ben for now to raise some of the questions from the chat, and so please, Ben.
Okay, thank you, Dietland. In the interest of time, let me paraphrase all the questions that are in the chat. Present them all at once. Then I have one question of my own, and then you can pick and choose which ones you want to answer. So from the chat, there's a question of basically, what happens if the election, and my dog is joining me now. What happens if the election is contested in court, Trump wins in court? Will Biden pull an Al Gore, recognize the decision of the court, basically concede the election, even if he's a clear winner of the popular, has a clear win in the popular vote or in the vote in the whatever key states? Second question is basically about the foreign interference, particularly the effect of Russian interference in the election this year. How important has that been, or is it? Third question has to do with essentially votes for third-party candidates. Are votes for third-party candidates, simply wasted votes when you have a close election and when those third-party candidates have no realistic chance of winning? So those are from the chat. And then the question I wanted to, my own question, I guess I wanted to push the panelists a little bit on, I think, differences between some of the remarks and then some of the discussion, comments made in the discussion. That, one way of interpreting, I think, many of the opening comments was that the Republican Party is, they're engaged in a race between, a changing electorate on the one hand, and they're responding with voter suppression and gerrymandering on the other. So at what point does that become an untenable strategy? I think David, or maybe it was Mark, suggested, it's not going to be one blowout. It's going to require 2 or 3 blowout elections. But at what point does that not become a workable strategy anymore?
Maybe I can answer the post-election situation, and then I have another panel at 4:45, so I have to exit. I guess what I would say about Biden conceding the election is that if these decisions in different states wind up going to the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court ultimately says this is an election that Donald Trump won, of course Joe Biden is going to concede the election. I actually saw Al Gore talk last night, and he has no regret either. His biggest regret is that he conceded and then took back the concession in Florida, because initially, before the recounts started there, the narrative had already shifted toward a situation in which George Bush may have won the state. But there was never any question, once the Supreme Court came down as the final arbiter of the law of the land, that was, the result. And so I think that what we're going to see, unless Joe Biden wins Florida and Georgia, which are well situated to count their votes early, and where victories for a Democratic presidential candidate in both of those states would suggest pretty widespread victories across the board. Unless that happens, I think it's very reasonable to expect that there are going to be challenges in various swing states and in various battlegrounds. And I don't think the question is going to be whether Joe Biden is going to accept those results. I think the question is going to be whether Donald Trump is, which is why, in fact, Stacey Abrams is registering every last voter in Georgia. She's registered now more than 10 times the voters that she lost her race by last time around. And, that kind of shift in Georgia, if the Democrats can also win Arizona, it makes the challenges that the Trump campaign and the Trump team might put forward in the courts less important. But I don't think that there's any question that the Democrats won't ultimately adhere to a decision issued by the Supreme Court. But anyway, thank you very much. And thanks to all of my fellow panelists. And I'm sorry, I've got to go.
Thank you, Jennifer. We will be in touch with you also with a thank you gift. So thank you so much for being there.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Thanks, Jen. And if you'd like, Dietland, I can try to handle the Russia question.
Yes, please.
So I think that, to be frank, I think it doesn't really matter. I think that the biggest way that Russia affected the election in 2016 was with the hack of the DNC that wound up being, with those emails that were released on the eve of the Democratic National Convention that revealed conversations between DNC folks that made it appear to a lot of Sanders supporters that the whole thing had been sort of rigged against them and made them really angry. And you saw that at the convention, and I think it influenced a lot of their decisions to stay home a couple of months later. This go around, there hasn't been anything quite that dramatic. I do think that we can confidently say at this point that the Hunter Biden laptop story is a Russian thing. Valeria referred to QAnon earlier. I also think QAnon is a Russian troll. But these things don't seem to be, or to the extent that they're affecting people, they seem to be affecting people whose minds are already made up, right? Sort of, again, I said a little while ago that 83% of Republicans think that Democrats are satanic pedophiles. That is, that may be coming from Russia, but those are people who are already going to vote for Trump, right? And so I don't frankly think that we can that we should worry about Russia swooping in at the last second and somehow changing this outcome. And I have thoughts on the other questions as well, but I'll let somebody else answer those.
Well, real quickly, I'll take a shot at the third party thing, and maybe a bit about the voter suppression piece, but just a quick thing on that. The third party candidacies in our election system, it is truly a wasted vote, at this point. And one thing that's really important, I think, to keep in mind about the third party candidacies for the most part that are cropping up, whether it's Kanye West or, some others, is that they're actually, being driven by Republican money. This is an effort on Republicans' part to try to get people who would otherwise vote for Democrats to throw their vote away, in a sense. So, this is sort of a bit of dirty tricks that, in particular, Roger Stone has been associated with for 20 odd years, 30 odd years, the old Republican political operative who's gotten to be so infamous. As it relates to voter suppression, it strikes me that this is what a party does when they're running out of gas. They don't compete for the types of voters whose votes they're trying to suppress. They know they can't win them. As one of the panelists noted earlier, it doesn't even appear that the Republicans are trying to win African-American votes. So if you're not going to try, then the other alternative is to try to create rules so that those people, those groups that are not going to vote for you can't vote. And so I feel like this is a last gasp saying, look, this is our only chance to win, given that we are, such an undiverse party.
Can I add to that just really quickly? Someone was, while the question was being raised, I actually wrote the words that the Republicans are running a race between the past and the future, right? If you're running campaigns between the past and the future, I think it's a kind of tough place to be in. And when Mark was talking, it made me think about the ways that Blacks were written out of American politics, voting and running for office at the end of the Civil War, coming out of Reconstruction, right? So we had a grand national experiment. Now we had, the nation had made it so that those Democrats who had been part of, on the losing end of the Civil War were not able to participate in politics for a period of time. And when they got back into politics, they made it so that Blacks could not, because Blacks would not agree to, or would not easily decide to vote for only one party or to stop voting for the Republican Party in Southern states. And so they were essentially moved out of politics and at least official interactions in politics in Southern states. The other thing, so that's remarkable. I think it's something I want to think about further. The other thing, though, is to David's point about Russia. Russia also did a lot of work for demobilizing Black communities in the 2016 election, and it was subtle and widespread, right? And difficult to trace until well after the election. Now that the cat is out of the bag, I don't know if it's working as well, but it may be. It signals in the same way as was discussed in the 50s and 60s and even 40s that race is a security issue, a national security issue in the United States. It can be exploited by foreign authorities to influence our politics, and it really means that we have to get a handle on it, which is a simple way of saying, talk about the impossible.
So a couple of other quick things on that, if I can, unless somebody else is in the queue.
No, it's okay, David.
Okay, great. I think the answer to the question of how long can the Republican Party plan to pursue this strategy and consider it viable, I think we've reached the tipping point now. I think that this is it, and I think that they are going to lose probably, right? And I think that the thing that happened in 2012 where, you know, the autopsy, the thing is that the establishment of the Republican Party then did buy into that. And they thought that they were going to nominate Jeb Bush or Marco Rubio in 2016, who would have pursued a more open and reasonable and inclusive type of Republican Party, at least as it related to Hispanic voters. The problem was that the primary electorate said, nope, we don't agree. And I think that may happen again in 2024, where there's going to be an effort in the wake of this loss to change the party a little bit. And I think that probably a plurality of Republican primary voters in 2024 will say nope, and they'll nominate somebody that's similar to Donald Trump, maybe his son. But then after that go around, I think that's when you're going to see a change. And I do expect the Republican Party to change dramatically with respect to its attitudes on race and sex and other things, because if they don't, they will simply cease to exist as a competitive party. And they, you know, when faced with that, they'll change. The final point I'll make in relation to suppression is that some survey work that we did this summer with a big sample of only African-American voters, and specifically a big subsample of young African-American voters, is that the more our sample respondents believed or heard or felt like Republicans are trying to suppress their vote, the more motivated they were to vote. And so that's something that we are seeing, right? I mean, you are actually seeing in response to this perception that they're being suppressed, extra efforts, right, to vote at higher levels than ever. And I think that we'll continue to see that over time.
Okay, I don't want to draw this too far out, but we still have two questions. So one was posed to me privately, and there is a hand up. So I just going to ask that private question for somebody who asked me to, and that I think is going to Valeria, but potentially also to others, about the changing support of Black men for Trump. Reportedly has changed from 10% in 2016 to about 21% now. Is there, you mentioned earlier, celebrities being potentially part of that story. How deep is that evidence, and is there really going to be a changing wave? So that's question number one. And I would like to ask Oz McClamrock also to ask the question relatively quickly, because these are going to be our last questions, I think. Is Oz Clamrock still around?
Yeah, I'm here.
Okay.
My question is for Professor Sinclair Chapman, although it could be anyone can answer with what they want. So obviously there's a lot of talk about Texas possibly flipping over to the Democrats at the national level here. And my question is, when taking into account the significant early voting turnout so far, along with the demographic change that's occurred since the last census, is that possible? And if so, can it be sustained even after this year?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I will try on both of those, but hopefully Mark and David and others can chime in. On the first question about Black men, I think that we're likely to see perhaps a small uptick. All the scholars who are paying, that I'm aware of, that are paying close attention to this, actually see it as being fairly soft, if anything at all. They're trying to sort out kind of why that would be the case. Black women drive Democratic politics, particularly in southern states, but not only. Black women made the difference in South Carolina for Barack Obama in the primaries. They made the difference for Biden in the primaries. And Black women are the most loyal Democratic voters. And so the peeling off of Black men, it also happened in 2016. So it might be, it might tick up a little bit higher. Honestly, and I don't have the data, this is my own speculation here. I think it has everything to do with the politics of masculinity and the navigation of that, the appeal of wealth and decisiveness for these, for Black men and for Black populations. We saw it particularly in places like Texas, where there was organizing of Black men for Donald Trump. But you also see, of course, people like Candace Owens and that kind of thing. So So it's just an interesting kind of outcome. I don't see it playing a major difference. It won't be enough to peel off significant Democratic support. We were concerned, I think, about Kanye potentially pulling off voters, but that has just kind of petered into the ether. Who, you know, although he had some support. The other question, I think, Texas. I'm hoping, and hopefully David and Mark and others. Boy, I really want to hear from Bert too. He does presidential politics, but. With Virginia, with Texas, I think is a case that's like Virginia. Part of what's happening in these southern states, you know, as well as shifts in education that David talks about, is that we're in the midst of a reverse migration. Coming out of the economic downturn in 2008, you began to see Blacks moving in greater numbers to southern states, right? Where they had been moving out for decades to northern cities. They began to move back to southern states. They moved into previously Republican districts. We ought to see an effect of that. And we ought to see an effect of that in state level politics. And particularly in these cities as they grow and they have that level of influence, perhaps even in state legislatures. I am not clear on whether Texas can turn blue. If it does, it'll be a coalition of Blacks and Latinos and of voter turnout efforts by the Democratic Party. As far as I can tell, the Republican Party has been much more aggressive about doing actual door knocking and in-person mobilization. I think the Democratic Party is behind on that. But what you do see is impressive early voting turnout in these states, in states like Texas and Georgia, and particularly amongst Black communities. So that is a signal. Great questions.
The only thing I would add is just to echo something Valeria said about African-American men. It does seem, at least in our data, to suggest that whether you want to call it competitiveness or aggressiveness or, sort of masculinity, the zero-sum competitive thinking, that seems actually to be something that makes Trump attractive to men, especially. So whether they're African American men or Latino men or white men.
Yeah, I can validate that as well. I actually wrote on this summer. If you Google my name in relation to this question, you'll find the article with a couple of co-authors with this survey that I referred to before. So we asked people the degree to which they agreed or disagreed with the following statement. I don't always like what Trump does, but I like the way he projects strength and defies the establishment. And close to 40% of young African-American men agreed with that statement.
Wow.
Right? And so that's the deal. However, having said that, I wholeheartedly agree with Valeria that it's not going to make any difference in this election anyway, because it's really women who drive turnout in the African-American community, and that turnout is going to be up. It's going to be overwhelmingly Democratic. And I don't think that Biden has to worry about, young Black men, peeling away too much in this go around. But it could be a thing, right, in the future, if the parties even more, right, tend to be kind of defined or if a cleavage emerges in terms of like, more of the mommy versus daddy party, or sort of like a masculine versus feminine party, like you could see that gender gap grow even bigger than it is now. And that would, again, relate to people of all ethnicities and races. The final thing I'll say about Texas is that I think that we shouldn't forget about Asians there as well. As Valeria pointed out, there's been this dramatic move over the course of the past 20 years from being like kind of 50-50 or having the Asian American population looking like white people in terms of how they voted. And now they're 72%, right, likely to vote for Democrats. And in places like Houston and other parts of Texas, that Asian American population is large, both East Asian and South Asian. And if they turn out in high numbers, they can make a difference.
Just to piggyback real quickly onto this with a sort of personal account, and it brings back in one of the things that David mentioned earlier about Joe Biden as the alternative to Trump in this case, because demographically, he is a Republican, at least in our stereotyped world. I, on the other hand, am not. I mean, I didn't go to elite schools, but I'm a professor and all that. And let me just add, I look the way that I do. I mean, Joe Biden actually talks about wanting to take Trump out behind the gym and get in a fight with him. This is not the kind of thing that I would say. All right. So with that in mind, let me tell a story. So I was getting ready to get on a plane to go to England just before the 2016 election, where of course I predicted that Hillary Clinton would win comfortably. So anyway, you see how that turned out. But anyway, I'm running late to the airport, and I pull up to the airport, and of course I'm late because I'm always late. And so I have to go to the valet, and I go to the valet, and two African American men take the car, and we get to chatting, as we're filling out the paperwork and everything. And one guy asked me, so where are you going? And I said, I'm going to England. I'm going to talk about the election. He said, oh, you're into politics. And I said, yeah, it's my job. And one of the guys looked at me, and he just sort of like looked me up and down, and he said, I bet you're voting for Hillary. And I said, how'd you know that? And he said, well, you're soft. And it was just like, it was just, but Biden's not, so if the candidate is, like me, then that's a big Trump advantage. But I think, Biden probably blunts that, kind of advantage in that respect. And I think it actually turns out to be really important, as it relates to this election.
Very interesting perspective. Are there any other, I think we should wrap it up now. Are there any other final thoughts? I hear you all about the prediction being rather that this is going to be a relatively safe Biden win and potentially on several levels. So this is also another takeaway for those who are listening. Are there any final thoughts? Otherwise, I'm going to close with one thought.
I have one quick one, and I'd like for David and Mark maybe to co-sign it because I don't know if it's true.
Okay.
But I think that if Biden wins Pennsylvania, that we're done. Is that true?
Well, I think probably, although I think that the safer bet I would say would be Florida or North Carolina or Georgia or Ohio, all of which we're likely to know on election night. If we see that Biden has won any of those states, it's over.
Okay.
Yeah. Mark.
As a Pennsylvanian, I wish it was Pennsylvania. But one of the things about Pennsylvania is they don't start to count their early votes until
okay.
It could be a week, if before we know what came out of Pennsylvania. So the key, I think, that David is getting at, hoping that Florida, Georgia, North Carolina, one of those states that counts early, that's the best bet.
Okay, awesome.
Right, the timing of the counting is another issue. Well, thank you, all of you. I just wanted to say, as a thank you, the CSDC, and Mark knows this, is known for giving a little gift to all the participants. Now, this is a little bit more awkward at this time around, but what we will do is we will send you your gift. I don't know if Wim is still there to show you the gift, or maybe Esther is, but here is the gift that will arrive.
I'm trying to.
You are in the dark, Wim. Oh, there you are. So this is a mug, as you can see, and it does. You can see it.
It is the best gift that you can give to an outside speaker. I'm not joking.
Always a mug. Always a mug. Yeah.
But wait, it's a special Mark, David. You don't know yet, but Mark has one of those, and I hope you still have it.
I do.
Because you visited before, and hopefully it's lasting. That's what I meant. But this basically, this mug has our poster of this panel on it, and so you will have a lasting memory.
Fantastic.
Wonderful. I'm excited.
Yeah, so that will arrive in your mail once you give Wim your mailing address. So this is our thank you, and very enjoyable, this discussion. I could go on forever, but in the interest of everyone's time, let's close it here. Thank you so much for these insights, and we'll hope to continue the discussion farther down the road. Thank you all. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, everybody. It was great being on the panel with you all. Thank you for the invitation. Bye.
Thank you, Valeria. Thank you, David and Mark, and Deborah had already to go.